Yeah, and then he kind of accepted the baby as his own baby, a child, and took it into his residence and wrapped it up in a blanket or something. He went and played tennis. But Harriet really liked that intern, that he was a very sensitive young man and very caring. And he was the one that brought the little 9-year-old girl into the hospital that looked like she was 80 years old. Do you recall that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And she had smallpox, and they vaccinated the whole ward for smallpox. And then the next day, she passed 46 worms, and then she died.
Mm-hmm.
And Harriet said something. She didn't know how many more animals she might have had inside her, and they would probably do an autopsy. But I found that very interesting. The health conditions, the illnesses that you mentioned earlier, including things like even like leprosy, that she and the people at the hospital had to deal with on a daily basis, let alone wounds from the war and just the normal things that people, broken bones and stuff. But that was a very busy place.
Yes, it was a busy place, and they were one of the few facilities around that could even offer any kind of treatment. And also what she talks about is the flooding. Now, I'm not an expert on Chinese history, but I remember as a youngster hearing about flooding in China. Sometimes millions of people died. And it wasn't just from the flooding, it was from starvation, because if their rice fields were flooded at the wrong time, they had absolutely no food available. And that is something I think in our world today that people just don't get it. And boy, I can remember my grandparents talking about how you had to have food put aside. This was mandatory, but they had gone through the Depression. And I can remember listening to those stories, and they were farmers. My grandparents came off of farms, and they were very, very attentive to making sure that they had food stores. And I learned later this was not uncommon in Virginia. A lot of people had the same attitude. Because
and then Harriet, she was there during the 1 year they'd have drought, and the next year they'd have floods, and some years they'd have both floods and drought. And it was you could see through her writings there was a constant struggle for the Chinese people to feed themselves, and so starvation and disease was very prevalent. When
we read history like this, many times when you are sharing stories of this nature with a younger generation, if they have never, ever had to deal with anything like this, if they have no understanding of farming, if they have no understanding about how the weather affects crops, worms, this type of thing, it's amazing how big their eyes get when they start hearing stories like this. They go, that has to be make-believe. But it isn't. It isn't.
True. In the first box of books that we received, we grabbed some for our grandkids, our sons and grandchildren, so they get hopefully they'll get a wonderment of Harriet and what she went through and her experiences and what an adventuresome, bright relative they come from. You know, very proud of that.
Well, there are so many aspects of the culture that she brings out, and one of the biggest aspects of the culture, which she felt often was a detriment to the Chinese people, and this was her opinion, of course, was the old established tradition of losing faith. This is something where they wouldn't stand up against people. Now, of course, then they went through the other extreme under Mao and his group. But it was a fascinating read, looking at her perspective and seeing and pointing out the various cultural components that kept a lot of people in a positioning of servitude, but the one thing she emphasizes over and over again is that the Chinese people were a peaceful people. Now, with history, you don't hear very much of that, but that's true. The Asian people are really a peaceful people in general.
Yeah, and she, one thing that became very evident throughout the book, too, is how much she loved the Chinese people and the country itself, and she loved to go on her pony rides out in the country through the rice fields along the rivers, and she did a lot of hiking in the mountains with her colleagues and so forth, and going on picnics, and she loved the culture, the land, and everything about her experience in Changsha, in China.
You have a photo in here, Carol, that shows the hospital ambulance, which is that. I looked at that and I said, yes, that is just like a pallet with two poles on either side and men carrying it, and that was the hospital ambulance.
The little tent covering over it.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Kind of puts Medic 1 in perspective, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And then you have photos in here of Chinese peasants who are in these round boats because their whole village, everything has been flooded. And she was fascinated with the fact that the people just didn't get all that upset over it because they'd been through it so many times. This has been happening in China for thousands of years. And they just go, well, we just have to go back and fix it up until the next time. And she made so many observations. And being an American and being educated as she has been, many of the Chinese people were not educated.
Yes, that's true.
And yet many of them were. And then, of course, she really loved her role as an educator at the nursing school there at the Yale in China program.
She brings out information, too, in her letters about how the Russians were very, very much involved in the revolutionary upheaval in China.
Yeah, they were a source of a lot of agitation, and she would marvel at how little bit of money they invested in their propaganda and how far it went. But the different revolutionary armies each of the generals had their own Russian advisor. So they were troublemakers way back then for sure.
Fascinating. Now, I know Shanghai at the time, and you have information in here in her letter on Chiang Kai-shek. There are photos in here. She brings out a story about the unearthing of an old tomb from the Han Dynasty. Tell us about that.
Well, it was a house along house along the riverbank, and during one of these flooding periods, the bank got washed away, and when it washed away, it opened up this kind of like a basement that had been sealed. And they went inside of it, and they were able to determine that it was from the Han Dynasty. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah, and it was quite a find, and there was no archaeologists in the way we have now, or anybody to preserve it, and there wasn't too much in there, but it was just the idea that it went back so many centuries. 5, 6, 7, 8 centuries or something of that nature. And there was some kind of like bricks that were made out of some kind of metal or pewter-like thing.
Pewter or silver. That area evidently had silver, Chinese silver.
Yeah.
And so we're not quite sure what this brick kind of stuff was made of. But she decided, well, maybe she'd take one.
Yeah, as long as all the rest of the tomb robbers were in there. She decided to take one or two for herself. So she had a little devilish streak about her, too.
But we've never seen it, never heard of it before. And in all of her belongings after she died, nothing. We have no idea whatever happened to it.
Wow.
One of the other things that really remarkable, along with her professional work, with the hospital and the nursing and the teaching of nurses and the management of the nurses and so forth, she also found time to be enterprising, and she was buying the Oriental rugs and sending them home, and linen and lace. And then she had an arrangement with the intern Lou he would collect pheasant feathers, and she would send those home for millinery work in the stateside, and then she'd pay him with American tobacco products, which they didn't know were bad for you back then. And so she had this little import-export international trade business going on while she was doing everything else. And then her romances, I mean, this lady I don't know where she got the energy.
Or the time.
She was younger. She wasn't in her 50s.
That's right.
She was younger. Carolyn, I wanted to ask you a question. Here you are as the great niece of this incredible woman that very few people would even know about. You do, because she's part of your family, and obviously now you've got this wonderful book, and because of her being just a fascinating lady, she was working at the University of Washington. A lot of students got to know her, so she affected the lives of thousands of people. How did this affect you? What was the most impressive, significant effect that you had after going through these letters?
Oh, goodness. I think, and pretty much for the whole family, none of us knew about what went on over there, really. We knew she'd been there and she taught nursing. That was kind of how we all grew up. But nobody thought to ask her about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it was so fascinating finding out all about her. And here we thought we knew.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, she was had been in the family for 90 years by the time she died, and everybody just kind of accepted her, and we knew she had done interesting things and had gone to China, and her professionally she was very active with the nurses and so forth, but we just became so comfortable with her that nobody thought anything about it, too much. But then we got into her letters, and we really discovered the full depth and breadth of her experience and her wisdom and her sense of humor, which we always knew she had a nice sense of humor, but to find that it was alive and well back in 1926 it was just a revelation for the entire family.
Yeah,
well, when one
a whole different person.
Yes. When one reads the
May have been the same person, but we appreciated her a whole bunch more.
Yes, I bet. Now, I know we're just about out of time here, but one of the things I want to mention, when you read a book and you're in the time frame, it really makes you aware of how much she saw and experienced before she left this earth at the age of 90, and the very amazing things that evolved, and yet, in many respects, how very little has changed with human nature. What's your website that people can go to find out more about Aunt Hat?
Aunt Hat, yeah. The website is www.healingromancerevolution.com.
healingromancerevolution.com.
Yeah.